Yesterday in the morning, we talked about two apparently very different things. We talked about values and value systems, and then after that, we talked about metrics and data and evidence. And Jill's career has really been dedicated to the place where those things join up. So in the first of these 30-minute sessions, Jill is going to talk about data and evidence and the relationship between that and working off a value base and working from values. So the point where those two things join up. Jill Robinson.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Before I get started, first, I want to provide you a definition of the word patron. At TRG, we use this philanthropically sounding word patron, but it's really just an elegant word for people who buy tickets and attend your events and buy memberships and make donations. Patrons are people. Second, an acknowledgement that this photo that I have up right now looks very much like the one that William Norris at Toffel Music used earlier today, although I must say that this group looks a little less polite, a little bit more like they're having fun, and that word fun is something that we learned from Culture Track is an important thing as it relates to arts and cultural motivation. It has been such an interesting week listening to all of the stories, the narratives in arts and culture in Canada, a country in which we've operated for a dozen years as a consulting firm. This weekend you feel so very familiar and so very not familiar to me at the same time. The Canada Council conversation that we had this morning, the pressures that you all must feel, that they feel, to return on the federal government's extraordinary investment here. And yesterday's Culture Track report and the data that pointed to the differences between philanthropic giving in your country and ours, and yet the investment in arts and culture, very similar when it comes to the arts. The institutional, courageous conversations and acts we heard about this morning. Audiences and patrons are part of the narrative that are running through so much of our table and panel conversations. The question that I'm posing today is this one. How can data bring the voice of patrons into your institutional conversations? What is your practice in listening to them? And does it affect your institutional decisions? I know, I hear how much you care, but here's the thing. It really takes courage. It takes grown-up behavior to regularly ask and listen to your patrons, even more courage to act on it. And it can be terrifying stuff, this getting feedback about our art, about the things that are in our exhibit halls and on our stages. I mean, what might the data actually say? And it's also true that we have a dizzying array of ways to measure success already, right? If the hall fills to the percentage of capacity sold that you think is right, if you have lines for your exhibits, there are lots of business models out here. If there is the right enrollment numbers for a conservatory or a school, if you meet revenue targets, if we simply like what we're doing, if we think it's right for our communities, curatorially or artistically, we call it good. But there's so much more to learn, so much more to hear. Many of you know us at TRG. We're that American consulting, I promise it gets better, firm that's data-driven, yes, and loyalty-obsessed, will admit to that. And we help organizations like the ones that you run build sustainable practices. We also host something we call community data networks. In 30-plus markets, organizations actually share patron data, transactional data for analytics and trading purposes. But here's something that we've learned from more than 20 years of consulting with nearly 1,000 organizations in 4 countries. Our sector doesn't listen so well. We like to talk. We like to talk to each other. But we're not terrific listeners. Over this 20-year history, I'd say less than 10% of organizations that we've gotten to know have come to us to say, I'm coming to you because I'd like to crack open that data I have, see what it says about our patrons and how they're engaging with us. Or we'd love to get a regular way to have patron feedback so that we can really hear and act accordingly. Now, we have a bias that I want to come clean about. If you know us, and many of you do, you know that we rely on transactional data, behavioral data for our analysis, because we've learned sometimes the hard way that what people say can be very different than what they do. Organizations can catch themselves coming and going when they act based on what people say they will do and then have to catch up with what they actually do. But we're also learning that you can pair up transactional data with qualitative research, like one-on-one conversations and surveys and focus groups to get an even stronger listening system. But here's another L word that's even more important than when you're considering listening through data, and that's leadership. This summit is designed for you, leaders of well-resourced arts and cultural institutions in Canada. It's quite a thing, actually. I haven't seen this type of gathering in any of the other countries in which we operate, and it's a good thing, because today the message I have for you is that listening to patrons, acting on what they tell you, requires courage. Courage to broker some tough conversations. It requires courage to have discipline. Courage. I am honored to be the person who gets to tell you the story of two organizations today, two listening and courageous organizations today in Vancouver. Now, you know Vancouver better than I do. Host of the 2010 Olympics, consistently ranked as one of the top 5 worldwide cities for quality of life, thriving economy, huge tourism industry. You may also know that it's been called a city of neighborhoods. Today, more than half the population is part of a distinct ethnic group. More than 50% of the population cite English as their second language. And in 2012, it was ranked as the second most unaffordable city in the world. Good news, bad news, right? Many who live in and visit Vancouver must have discretionary time and income to spend on arts and culture, and many do not. You also likely know the two organizations in this story, Arts Club Theatre Company and the Cultch. These two organizations are similar and very different. Similar in their desire to understand and deeply connect to their audiences and communities. We'll get to that in a minute. But they're different too in their organizational size and scope and in the Vancouver that they see in Vancouver. Allow me to remind you about them a bit. Arts Club Theatre Company began in 1958 as a private club for artists and musicians and actors, basically a watering hole for artists at a time when the only way to drink publicly was to become the member of a club. In 1964, they discovered a former gospel hall above that club and converted it to a 150-seat theater. Peter Kathy White, their executive director who's here with us today, told me that this was the space where local artists back in the day could stage plays they loved. Plays the Vancouver of 50 years ago needed to see, needed to experience, and needed in their community to grow culturally. This origin story, local artists, local stories for the local community, is deeply rooted in their mission and their sense of place. Now, Arts Club is one of the largest nonprofit theater companies in Canada. It has 3 stages that are in the theater district here and the popular tourist destination Granville Island. And while Vancouver is a complicated city, Arts Club feels lucky to call it home. Believes many of its realities, tourism, demography, and its growth, have helped support the company's growth too. Next season is the first for new artistic director Ashley Corcoran, who's here with us too. She follows Bill Millard, who'd been the artistic director for 46 years. Big, exciting transitions coming at Arts Club. The Cultch is celebrating its 45th anniversary this season, and it operates in the residential neighborhood of East Vancouver. East Vancouver is a microcosm of Vancouver, more diverse, more politically active, especially in the areas of social justice. And the Cultch's executive director, who's streaming, hi Heather, Heather Redfern, and her team, they want to make sure that their organization reflects this diversity. Heather also reminded me that even as they are devoted to East Vancouver, Vancouver isn't always easy, she said. Its diverse communities can be quite insular. There's a huge economic divide in the city between those who have and those who don't. Colonization has left a really tough legacy within the Indigenous community. At the Cultch, located in East Vancouver, we find ourselves straddling this reality all the time. The organization is a presenter, has always been what Heather calls an alternative venue, one that presents contemporary, edgy work. Programming is highly eclectic, has multiple audiences depending on which production is on the stage. The vision, though, is to be totally inclusive. As their tagline says, the Cultch is for everyone. And they believe this, that interaction with art is a human necessity, that everyone deserves and has a right to partake. Their original building is in the heart of East Vancouver. It's a converted church, 2 spaces, went through a major renovation in 2008. They saved the York Theater down the street on Commercial Drive from demolition. They renovated it and reopened it in 2013. Both of these organizations are focused on their audiences. Arts Club has been prioritizing them seriously for a decade. And in the early stages, through focused improvement in practices focused on audiences, they saw revenue increases of $3 million over 3 seasons that Peter helped drive as marketing director with Howard Jang, who's part of our host team here when he was executive director there. Buoyed by this and heading into the 50th anniversary that some of us heard Howard talk about yesterday, they began talking to patrons directly, asking questions about the intrinsic value of their art. I'll come back to this. When Peter became executive director, they began then integrating all of their organization's departmental activity around the patron, really putting the patron at the center, digging into the data, segmenting audiences, working to deepen the relationships. And those patron results continued to the tune of almost another $3 million by 2016. The Cultch, while smaller, has focused on their audiences for a long time, too. Renovating their building in 2008 helped immensely, but public funding had stalled, and they recognized the need to start focusing on audiences with discipline and attention. They, too, saw results. A decade ago, their budget was $1.2 million, and over this decade, when public funding was frozen for them, their total revenues grew to the almost $4 million that they have today, an increase of more than 300%. A decade ago, revenues from patrons, people, remember, ticket buyers, members, donors, was just 20% of their income. Today it's 40%. And Heather attributes this directly to prioritizing their audiences, listening to and learning from them. So they kept going. And this is the nexus of the story. From 2015 to 2017, they started listening through data specifically for the voice of their audiences and their patrons. And they learned a lot. At Arts Club, the team had already organized their transactional or behavioral data into understandable categories by patron groups based on where they were in the relationship journey with Arts Club. But then they grouped the data into programmatic buckets. They were curious, what types of programs were specific types of patrons attending? They took 5 years of programmatic history and created categories for those programs like blockbuster musicals, Canadian works, classic drama, new works. They became interested not only in learning about which programmatic categories were attracting new audiences, that was and continues to be important, but also understanding how programming and the patron journey related to each other. Were loyal patrons behaving differently, attending differently? Now, the fear in asking this question always is, will the data just tell us to do blockbusters like Beauty and the Beast? They were a bit nervous. Every organization that we see do this work is. But they knew they needed to understand patrons beyond traditional labels. And they wanted to know what kind of programs were most appealing along the patron journey, and they wanted to marry the intrinsic information I mentioned before. Which productions were making the audiences lose themselves, really connect. And then they were curious about how they could leverage those productions to encourage more return visits to the company, deepening the relationship with patrons. Peter was particularly interested in finding a new way of reporting the impact of the art adjacent to, alongside financial reporting. Intrinsic, not just financial impact. They asked questions like, did this performance give you a sense of pride in where you live? Were you exposed to a new kind of art? Did this performance cause you to think about an issue or a topic? Did it resonate with you emotionally? Did you lose track of time and get fully absorbed? And increasingly important, did it give you a new sense of, or a new understanding of people that are different than you, or for a culture other than your own? Together, the behavioral and intrinsic data tells a powerful story. It's no surprise to Peter's team, to us, that well-known blockbuster musicals draw new audiences to Arts Club. Shows like $1 Million Quartet. Musicals are the gateway there. But it's not true for every blockbuster musical that the intrinsic data scores high positively, too. The data revealed that this particular show was one that did, though. It resonated emotionally. People lost track of time and got fully absorbed. It helped the team see what a powerful gateway experience this show actually was, beyond the obvious financial and attendance success. Might these patrons repeat? Come back more easily or quickly. But here was a surprise. They also learned through the behavioral data that new works, Canadian works, contemporary work of every kind, comedy, musical, drama, shows like Dorothy Dittrich's emotional drama, The Piano Teacher, which was an Arts Club commission, and its commission, Mom's the Word. It's become an internationally successful franchise, and Bitter Girl, the contemporary Canadian musical. These are the programs that appear to support the relationship journey with Arts Club. They're the ones that repeat patrons, multi-buyers, subscribers, donors attend. Loyal patrons attend musicals, yes, but these loyalists are the ones who attend new works, contemporary works, Canadian works the most. They're also some of the shows that scored highest on the intrinsic scale, causing people to think about issues and topics, exposing them, helping them think about other cultures in their communities, giving them a sense of pride about where they're from. Peter said to me, imagine me with an Australian accent. Peter said to me, by using this intrinsic and behavioral data, we could show to our board and funders and donors in a familiar financial presentation format how our art was resonating with the audiences, how it made them feel about our company, and how the productions that we get really excited about as artists also excite our patrons as they get to know us better. For some productions, especially new works, this reporting is critical. It's critical to our narrative about why we artistically invest in new work that carries financial risk. It tells the story directly from our patrons about why it's important for Arts Club to continue to invest in this way. Ashley's interested in taking this work and amplifying it based on her own artistic vision. And the next step is understanding the multi-year trends between programming and intrinsic data. At the Cultch, the motivation was similar but different. Heather had a fundamental question. Could data actually help us to better realize our goal of access for all? She wondered if we were to reflect on our data, again, categorize it by programming, yes, but also by values. The community value the program is inherently trying to connect with. Could we better understand what motivates a patron to try the Cultch and then deepen their relationship with us? The goal? Providing arts experiences for a broad range of citizens in East Vancouver and financial stability for the Cultch. And then, could we use this data to actually plan and program the season? She named and claimed it, calling it the Democratizing Our Stages Project, and got the Vancouver Foundation to help her fund. Did I show you that logo? The Vancouver Foundation to help her fund the necessary analysis and staff time. The project recognized that already diverse programming actually needed more audience diversity in the right ways, based on what the communities and her patrons were expressing that they wanted. The theory Heather had going in was that the initial attendance decisions are actually motivated by a whole range of factors, only one of them being programming, which for the Cultch, like some of you, is a variety. Dance, comedy, spoken word. Her theory was that often programming is the least important factor in decision making, that in fact a value associated with the work that we often don't put in marketing copy often guides decision making. So this is aesthetically pretty Heather. She's not only the executive leader, but she's also the artistic head. She analyzed her programming decisions at the Cultch, broke it down, and realized that she wanted to purposefully contemplate three things together. The first was financial impact. Based on the work they were already doing, it wasn't just top-line revenue she was looking at. She literally asked herself the question, will we be able to retain these audiences for future financial impact? She looked at timing. What's the right time to place this program in the season? If some programs are better at creating repeat buyers, might we front load them so we have more time to invite them and develop relationships with them? And then finally, values, which was the most interesting question to Heather. She forced herself for the Democratizing Project to articulate the values that she saw in her community of East Vancouver and that she had been trying to program around. She created buckets of these values. Things like productions that include and represent East Vancouver's Indigenous population, that represent and discuss gender politics, topical issues of the day, productions that provide representation and opportunity for diversity of age, race, and disabilities, unique shows that she was confident that only the Cultch would bring, content for her current audiences that they love to see, she knew she would want to program regularly, and, importantly, programs that she was scheduling specifically for new audiences. Finally, she asked another important research question that I hear you all asking. How can we hear our community not only through the data within our systems, but also in important one-on-one conversations with people who represent the values that she was trying to program for? So she sought partners who could help. Partners like the Downtown Eastside Women's Center, Community, the Union of British Columbia Indian Chiefs, the Canadian Mental Health Association, and more. The analysis that the Democratizing Project relied on most heavily to start tracked the audience journey behaviorally, looking at their experiences through the lens of the values you heard me describe. In essence, the Cultch was asking, where do new audiences enter? Through which values? Are there predominant ones? And once they attend, are there values that seem to be more easy at creating repeat purchase? And also importantly, where do patrons come in and then exit, never to return again? And here's some of what we learned. The programs that had the highest proportion of new audiences were not programs in Heather's new audiences bucket. They were these. The programs best at creating repeat purchase were these. And importantly, the programs who purchased these programs were the least likely to exit. The Cultch began using this data immediately. And because they'd also studied the data based on arts genre, the programming itself, Heather married the two together to influence the timing of programming. This is when the ideas of twos really began to hit her. How can we create patrons who will repeat up at least twice in the season, creating the almighty sticky patron? She began engaging her whole team, but in particular her patron development manager early on in her season programming process. And they developed a season planning process that would theoretically attract new audiences early in the season and then create these opportunities for repeat attendance as the season unfolded. They combined this with direct conversations with the partners that I mentioned who helped them make stronger programming decisions. They engaged them in participatory two-way conversation as partners, and those partners then in the community represented and participated in communicating about the Cultch's programs in the community. They created invitations to patrons that reinforced not only the quality of the programming, but the values behind the work. Heather theorized they'd grow attendance and repeat purchase. Both things were important. And so far, it's working. Overall attendance during this 17-18 season that's not finished yet is the highest on record. And they've seen a 25% increase in repeat ticket buyers, 15% growth in 5-pack subscribers, 30% growth in 8-pack subscribers. And they know and believe that this is in direct connection to this strategy that they have implemented in East Vancouver. So listening to patrons, it's possible and sometimes scary. It does require grown-up conversations. My colleague, Jeff, is going to be describing his cultural value project, and one of the things his excellent report talks about is the need to be able to have grown-up conversations when we're doing research and digging deep into data on behalf of the sector. But this digging deep also creates an opportunity for new narratives. And for the Arts Club, the narrative was around the power of new and risk and innovation. For the Cultch, it's the power of connection with community values. As leaders, I'd remind you of one final thing, and it's this. I find myself saying it all the time. It is that data doesn't do anything. People do everything. So as leaders, you must prioritize the gathering of data. You must share it, have hard conversations with it, grapple, dig in it, and then lead your people on your teams and your communities to act differently as a result. Arts Club and the Cultch are two organizations in this country who are doing that well. You can too. Thank you.